For week 7, we'll be installing the cedar siding, which will make up the outside wall surface of the camper. Sometimes I'll refer to this as skinning the camper, or I will refer to the outside surface as exoskeleton. How you do it just comes down to a couple key steps. Now, figuring out this process is what makes this camper work. So step 1, sizing the boards to a consistent width. So in this case, I set up a jig for all of the boards, and I simply use my table saw and I run it down and rip it all to the same width. This is key to make sure that you have consistency in the joints. Number 2 is you measure the span that you want to fit, and then you cut it on the saw to length. In this case, I use a compound miter saw. The next step is going to be to route the grooves on either side of the board that will intersect with each other and create a waterproof seal, and will provide for the ultimate strength of the boards when they bond together. In some cases, you're meeting boards end to end. You also want to cut a groove there. Then you want to install the caulking. In this case, I use DAP brand Dynaflex. And this is key to have an adhesive layer to hold the wood pieces of wood together and create a waterproof layer. You fit the piece on. I typically eyeball a gap between the boards of about 1/8 of an inch, nail it in place, and then wipe off the excess caulking. As you saw, the gap between those was about 1/8 of an inch. I just eyeball it. I know to many that probably makes you cringe, and if you want to create a little jig to create more space, so be it. But creating that little gap between the boards is key to allow for proper expansion. And that's also where that Dynaflex caulking comes into place. That caulking has an adhesive quality which will hold the board steadfast to the individual frame components, but it will allow that wood to expand and contract as it absorbs water. That's going to happen. If you didn't have an expansion joint in there, the walls would tear themselves apart because they would expand and push against each other. So that caulking was really key to making the whole system work. And as you can see, you just rinse and repeat with the process as you go. Now, I know to many, seeing all of that caulking on the side probably looks like a big mess to clean up later, and there is no way of getting around the fact that it is. But simultaneous, I also found that it's nearly impossible to put in these individual planks and not have caulking create a mess on the outside. So if you take a wet napkin or a wet paper towel and you just wipe it up as you go, that's about as good as it's going to get. Just remember, as the process goes, you're going to inevitably have to sand. That's just how that cookie crumbles. All right, let's talk a little bit more about that joint I was talking about between the individual boards. So both of these are just example pieces, of course, but these are the same pieces that would define the cedar siding on this camper. Now you could see there what I did, and this is how I did them all, is I used that 1/2 inch square bit in my router, and I cut a groove down each side of the boards. Now, for the example piece, I didn't, but the groove would be on the opposite side of this board. Now I nail, we'll nail this board. This board would be nailed to the side of the camper, and then the board that would go on top, intersect on top, would fit into that groove like this. You guys see that? Now that 1/8 inch gap I was talking about is that gap right there. And then the caulking goes all into this groove area right here. So what this does is this produces a flexible, waterproof joint. And that caulking, I've talked about it a lot, has 2 purposes. 1, it provides for a waterproof seal between these boards. But 2, it has a very strong adhesive quality. It's amazingly strong. So I don't think this would be as strong as like using traditional wood glue, but I would argue, and this is just my opinion, it's darn close. So essentially, once you put that caulking in and attach these boards on the framing and they overlap each other like this, they almost form a singular surface, okay? a singular platform, if you will. And putting in consideration that these are about half an inch thick, it produces that exoskeleton effect that I talk so much about that defines the overall strength of this camper. The framing, of course, provides some structural strength, but more so, I would argue, it's just the skeleton from which the skin, or in this case, the cedar planking, attaches to and forms the ultimate strength of this camper. And then don't forget that those cedar boards that intersect each other in the caulking is then nailed to the framing portion of the camper with 18 gauge brad nailers. As I've talked about many times in nauseam and have a whole video that's talking about it, my preference for the 18 gauge brad nailer is a cordless version. I use a Milwaukee one. But back to the point, a key aspect is that same caulking that you put between the lap joint sections of those siding, you also put on the frame structure before you nail the cedar siding on it. And that caulking on the frame structure acts as both that adhesive glue and a flexible joint membrane when attaching those cedar sidings. You guys can see it there in all of these time-lapse videos. As far as the length of the 18 gauge brad nails I use to attach the cedar boards to the framing, they're 2-inch nails. I have a variety of lengths that I'll use for different applications so they don't pop through. Inevitably, every once in a while, one will. It's not a big deal. You just trim it off and fill it in. Now, you will have markings on the board where you actually are nailing them in. That's just, you can't really avoid that. I will actually take a little bit of that caulking that's on the outside and fill in those holes. When we do a lot of sanding later, we'll smooth it over. And it's not a perfect filler, but it's good enough. Keep in mind, the outside of this camper is really meant to idealize a rustic look. So that's nice when you work because you got to let a little bit of flexibility in when you make errors, and the wood's going to have individual variations that you can't really get around, and knots and so forth. And that's just the style. I'll say it again, and I've said it many times in the past. Take your time. Installing all of these cedar boards, I actually got it done pretty quick, just over a week. But man, it was a lot of work, and it's a lot of time. And it can get pretty tedious. It's even physically demanding. As you can see, I'm bending down and moving around. But just take your time, work through it slowly. I'll admit in this portion, I just kind of wanted to get it done, and I rushed a little bit. Everything was fine, but I kind of had to slow myself down for all the points that we've talked about before. Enjoy the journey. Focus on the individual tasks. Make it a meditative experience, or at least that's my perspective. I hope you guys are enjoying these videos. I hope you see them not only as an instructional video, I guess you could say, but as an inspiration to build something yourself and have the confidence to do so, and maybe even a little bit of philosophy in life that we can all look to and apply in our everyday experiences. For me, building this camper is not just about building the camper. It's about the journey and a final destination that's beyond just a tiny house on a truck.